Thanks for tuning in to the third episode of the General's Redoubt's new podcast series, General Lee Speaking, an alumni history of Washington and Lee University. This series is all about our alma mater's unique heritage. Join us each episode as we discuss the critical characters and events that transformed a small Scots-Irish academy into one of the premier institutions in America. Hear from alumni, students, and professors as they share their experience and perspective on these moments. And most importantly, understand why we must instill current and future generations of generals with a passion for Washington and Lee's past. I'm your host, Cameron Spivey, recording from Fancy Hill's new podcasting studio. Hope you can visit us sometime soon. I am joined today by alumnus and historian Neely Young. Those of you who live in Lexington or have followed the Redoubt for years will know that Neely was one of the original founders of TGR, and you've likely read some of his work within Washington and Lee's history. Neely, before we jump into Robert E. Lee's influence on the traditions of our alma mater, why don't you briefly introduce yourself and tell our listeners why this subject is so important to you and perhaps even all members of the W&L community?
Thank you, Cameron. As you said, I'm an historian. I have a PhD in history from Emory University, and I've written a couple of books on slavery and anti-slavery in this area, and numerous articles about Washington Lee athletics, honor system, etc. I think that Lee was the most important figure in the history of the university. I believe we have always given him credit for saving the institution, but I'm not sure we've given him enough credit for the manifest changes, progressive changes that he made, not only to Washington Lee, but through Washington College, now Washington and Lee, on other educational institutions throughout the South.
Yeah, I think it's really hard, even in a 45-minute program, to explain all the things that Robert E. Lee did for the college. And we've even in the last year tried explaining that in as little as 3 or 4 minutes in little short videos. And his impact on the university is just so encompassing, and not just his immediate impact, but the legacy, the sort of Robert E. Lee values that have continued to shape generations of students, educators, presidents at the university. And so for this program in particular, I want to focus on the things that Robert E. Lee himself did, the changes he instituted, the examples he set from the fall of 1865 when he became president of the college, which he didn't even know about until they told him he'd become president, all the way till his death in October of 1870. And I think probably the biggest, most popular subject within that, the sort of tradition, is the honor system. And so I want to talk about what Lee did to the honor system, but before that, could you talk a little bit about what, quote unquote, the honor system looked like in the fall of 1865 before Lee got there?
The common misconception is that Lee started the honor system at Washington Lee. There was an honor system in effect prior to the Civil War, but it was rather inconsistently applied, and it was run more by the faculty than by the students. So when Lee came, there was this idea of honor at the university, but Lee, through his example and through the things that he allowed and encouraged, developed the most important aspects of what we now consider our honor system.
So you don't think it's fair to say that Lee had nothing to do with the honor system?
I can say that is simply not true. He had a great deal to do with the two most important aspects of the honor system, the student-run honor system and the single sanction. These are the things which distinguish the Washington Lee honor system from many other honor systems, and Lee was the driving force behind those two elements.
Yeah, those are, I think, certainly, especially the single sanction seems like very unique even today to Washington and Lee University. So before we get to those changes, what would the honor system or the system of disciplinary honor, whatever, have looked like at Washington College prior to the Civil War?
Students did take an honor pledge, and they said that they would not lie, cheat, or steal in their academic work. If they were caught having violated the honor system, they were punished in some way. But as I say, that punishment was inconsistent. Sometimes they were expelled. Sometimes they were allowed to retake an exam. Sometimes they were allowed to remain on the campus. The big key to everything, in my view, was Lee's view of student self governance in all areas. And it's a little surprising to me because Lee was a military man, but almost all of the changes which he made at then Washington College were based on his view that the students were responsible for their own behavior, whether it had to do with honor or selecting courses or athletics or fraternities, whatever. He allowed a tremendous amount of latitude to the students in developing traditions and institutions. Among these, and perhaps the most important, was the honor system.
Yeah, I think we would be remiss not to just explain the culture of this small Lexington college prior to Lee's arriving, and from its founding in the mid 18th century all the way up until Lee's time, it was markedly a Presbyterian ministry school, teaching students to become ministers or lawyers. They were studying Latin and Greek, mathematics. They weren't taking the classes that they would start to take when Lee becomes president, and obviously the classes that we're taking today with much more broader liberal arts curriculum. It was a Presbyterian school drawing mostly Scots-Irish students to learn in this sort of classical Presbyterian model. And for generations of years and students at Washington College, Washington Academy, Liberty Hall Academy, there was always complaints that the students weren't well disciplined. And there was a lot of sort of what I think today we might consider authoritarian views. William Graham, the first rector, sort of the first president of this college, he leaves the college in 1796, right after he writes George Washington about donating stock. For multiple reasons he leaves, but one of the main ones is because he had become really disillusioned with the student behavior, this what was called post-war degeneracy of the students that after, they've won independence, now everybody wants to do whatever they want. They want to dance, they want to play cards and dominoes and whatever else. And that was not tolerated at the academy then. And throughout the antebellum period, it seems like that sort of social life is restricted. And so the faculty have concerns. Even the president right before Lee, George Junkin, he leaves the college because students are acting against his authority and he wants to have the authority against students. It's very much a sort of top-bottom disciplinary style. And Lee clearly changes that because of the descriptions you hear from students. It sort of becomes whether or not Lee himself is implementing all these things, they revere Lee in a way. They have a lot of respect for him and they recognize that they need to act honorable themselves. And I think the students sort of start self-policing themselves. Do you agree with that, Neely?
Yes, I do. Lee, of course, was an Episcopalian from Eastern Virginia and not a Scotch Irish Shenandoah Valley type guy. And he, of course, saved the college. There were about 40 students there, and under his aegis, the school grew to 400. And he attracted people, not just from Virginia, but from the South and all over the country, who admired Lee and respected his leadership. Lee recognized that he was building something much more than the typical Scotch Irish authoritarian type of school. He wanted it really to be a national school, and he developed these ideas of curriculum and student participation with the idea in mind of making this the most progressive institution in the South, if not in the nation.
So let's talk more about this student self-governance idea. And maybe you might have specific examples of it, Neely, but I think the thing that sticks out to me is right before Lee becomes president, he's leading one of the largest armies assembled in, well, certainly in American history, the Civil War, massive armies, and he's coordinating this. It seems like Lee's not the type of person to micromanage individual activities. And a lot of the faculty that he brings in are themselves Confederate generals, Confederate veterans that he gets to come to Washington College to educate students. And I can just imagine because of that, they're letting the students sort of self-manage because anybody that has any military knowledge knows you're controlling the people directly under and they're controlling the ones under, and so on and so on. And so that camaraderie from the war, I'm sure, helped. But what's it looking like for students during those 5 Lee years?
We've mentioned some specific aspects at a chapel one day. He basically said that the system of self-governance and the honor rests upon the students. We have other quotes from students at that time and from professors indicating that Lee promoted this idea. He walked the campus. He knew all the students by name. He had an open door policy. He really was a modern progressive educator, and his attitude toward the students very, very different, as you pointed out, from the attitude before the Civil War. He developed the concept of electives. He developed the idea that students would choose their own majors. He broadened the curriculum, as you mentioned, to include both liberal arts and practical studies. He encouraged in every way a different concept of the university. And really, he was among the first in the country to do this. So I see Lee as very important, not just for, quote, saving the college, and not just for the example he set, but for the very practical steps he took to develop a modern college.
There's an example that comes to mind of that sort of responsibility, the weight that students are bearing themselves when Lee is around. There was a letter written, I think in the 1930s, one of the General Lee's boys, that's sort of that generation, 5 years of students who studied under Robert E. Lee's presidency. After the Civil War veterans start dying off, and there's a lot of people reflecting on those periods. On this 1935 Chapel Hill Weekly column, there was a student who talked about his time with President Lee and the sort of interactions he had. He was a student for 1 or 2 years while Lee was still alive, and he says during that time, he only actually had 2 personal interactions with Lee. One was sort of a standard one where Lee called him into his office to go over his academics. The other was when he'd wanted to go out to the Maury River to go ice skating, which was one of the few things to do. I guess much hasn't changed. There's not much to do in Lexington in the winter. And so he wanted to go out, and he says how all his friends were going. But he said, I did not want to go out of my classes for fear it would injure my term stand. Therefore, I decided to ask General Lee's permission, and then I would be all right. And he says when he made his application to go ice skating that General Lee refused it, explaining very kindly that if he gave me permission, he would have to give it to all who applied, and he could not interrupt college routine on the account of skating. And he says, now I was in a fix. If I went without permission, I'd have violated what General Lee told me. And he ends up going on several paragraphs, and this highlight is posted on TGR's website. But he ultimately says that he went ice skating, and the guilt from doing that, from violating Robert E. Lee, ate him up enough that he never disobeyed Robert E. Lee's word again. This, of course, going ice skating is probably not an honor violation. I know students certainly miss class now for recreational activities, but I think that just goes to emphasize the weight that was on students to follow what General Lee said. And Lee is such a famous, important figure that even if they respected previous presidents at the college, that weight is going to be different. I think Lee's background, his history, causes this honor system to develop, the sort of student self-policing. And so this student never went out on his own again and skipped class because of this interaction just from what General Lee had told him. So I think that speaks a lot to that student-led aspect of the honor system.
The criticism of Lee, from the perspective of some modern individuals, is that you can't pinpoint exactly that Lee caused this thing to happen or caused that thing to happen. But I think you've pointed out perhaps the most important aspect of Lee, which is his own character, his own sense of honor, his own sense of what it meant to be a gentleman or a gentlewoman. And that has affected generations of students at Washington Lee. When I was a student at Washington Lee in the 1960s, this was still very much a part of the culture of the university. And one of the things that disturbs me today is this attempt to minimize or denigrate Lee's contribution to the college. I happen to believe, along with Charles Braceland Flood, who wrote a book called Lee's Last Years, that the 5.5 years from Appomattox until Lee's death in October of 1870 were the most important and influential years of his life, not only for his influence on Washington College, but for his influence throughout the South and the nation.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great reminder of another historical segment that the Redoubt recently produced of a bunch of Northern abolitionists who were totally opposed to General Robert E. Lee and everything the Confederacy stood for. Yet 3 years after that, they are in New York actively campaigning for Robert E. Lee and Washington College. And there's a minister, Roswell Hitchcock, who is a pretty important New York educator, and he gives a speech that we have on our YouTube channel you can listen to, where he's lauding Lee for all of his work to rebuild the country and to develop educational goals and to educate the South, rebuild the South. So, I think that reflects a lot on Lee's own honor, the sort of shared goal that he held with Northerners who he fought against. And I just think that it's hard to understand that weight today, how impactful it was. But I think it also speaks to that ongoing legacy of Lee, and that even if Lee didn't himself write the student bylaws, formed the executive committee in 1905 when that, officially is introduced, I think the students then were sort of thinking of Robert E. Lee's role, right? The sort of spirit of Lee was with them. And I think even the White Book or one of the student codes, it talks about Lee Chapel and assembling there and the weight of being in a place that is so connected to Lee and the life that he lived. Even after Lee died, his legacy continued to shape the honor system. And I would imagine you, Neely, when you were at W&L, I know I can attest to this. When I would do an action, I would often ask myself, would Robert E. Lee do this, right? What should I do? Is Robert E. Lee going to be okay with this? And if he's probably not, then you might want to reconsider.
Yes, 2 points that you made. One of the greatest supporters of Lee was Henry Ward Beecher, the perhaps best known abolitionist beside Garrison, and the brother of Harriet Beecher Stowe, who also supported the cause because they recognized that what was needed at this point was peace and reconciliation. I believe the two most important national figures in the period from Appomattox to 1870 were Robert E. Lee and Ulysses S. Grant, who, from different perspectives, both supported bringing about reconciliation among the races and among the different sections of the country. Lee certainly was important for what he did at Washington Lee, but he was also important for what he did, as I mentioned in my article, The New South, and also for the nation as a whole.
Is that something you want to read about?
The quote I was interested in was Lee's quote in the chapel, where Lee reminded the students that the faculty has promulgated no rules for student government, that each and every one was presumed to be a gentleman, and that by tacit agreement the control of the students was left to the student body and the individual sense of honor of each student. This is the first quotation of this sort from any leader of Washington College in its history, and it speaks volumes about how Lee viewed the students and their sense of honor, and how the whole focus of the honor system should begin here at this point and continue to develop over the next 70 years or so. And Custis Lee, Robert E. Lee's son, also furthered development of the honor system. He's usually not considered to have been a great president, but he was very much a follower of his father and believed in many of the same things educationally and in terms of a sense of honor.
Yeah, I think that once again speaks to the Lee legacy. And even though GWC Lee, who was president for nearly 30 years, even though he wasn't a great administrator and that he did not want the job, that connection to Lee really helped the school sustain its reputation. And again, as the honor system develops, I think people just think of the Lee family, which beyond Robert E. Lee is just a well-regarded family. And it's unfortunate that legacy has been tarnished recently, but I think there's certainly a lot of redeemable aspects, and we should look to Lee's reconciliatory efforts as a good example of that. I want to speak more on another change you mentioned during Lee's time, which is the single sanction. But before we do that, let's take a quick break to hear from our first sponsor.
Hello, Alex Kagan here, editor of the Washington and Lee Spectator student newspaper. As a 501c3 nonprofit, we rely on people like you to fund our journalism, keeping all journals up to date on campus events and news. If you would like to donate, visit our website at www.wluspectator.com and we will send you our next print edition as our way of saying thank you. We also accept alumni and community opinions, which can be emailed to editor@wluspectator.com. Thank you for your support.
One of the things that really marks our honor system beyond all others is the single sanction, that no matter what thing you do that's considered unhonorable, that's enough for you to be removed from our university. And Neely, you're saying that that develops during Robert E. Lee's presidency.
Yes, one of the things that has not been looked into by other historians and scholars is statements from the students who attended Washington College while Lee was the president. And if you read those statements, it's clear from their own statements that Lee, A, set the example, B, allowed the students to run the honor system, and that the students turn developed the single sanction. I have a couple of quotations from students at that time. One is from a bishop in the Episcopal Church. If a man was caught cheating, his life was made so intolerable by the students that he was glad to go home. Another one, the students saw in him the personification of honor. If a student cheated on examination, his fellow students discovering it, the act expelled him. So even though they didn't call it the single sanction, and even though this was not codified until the early 20th century, it's clear that the students themselves, in developing their honor system, and this is Lee's genius, he did not, as you say, impose things. He set examples, he made suggestions, and he allowed the students to develop their own systems, whether it's in sports or fraternities or the honor system. This is not to say that the faculty did not try to intercede in these matters from 1870 until 1900, but it became less and less. In almost all cases, the faculty, this is the interesting thing to me, their impositions, their punishments were less harsh than those of the students. The students were clear that if anyone violated the honor system because they revered Lee so much in his sense of honor, that he should be removed. There was no question about it in their minds. But the faculty occasionally thought, well, maybe this is not so bad, we won't do it. But as time went on, more and more the students will.
You brought up the point that it's not called the single sanction, and I think we really need to emphasize here that the traditions that start during Robert E. Lee's time, or that really burgeon during his time, aren't all codified. It's not like Robert E. Lee signed an executive order that implemented all these things, but you can trace the roots to them, and they continue to grow and develop and change over time. The honor system, even from when you were there, Neely, is going to be a little different from how it is when I'm here. These things come and go. And so I think a great comparison beyond the honor system is to look at fraternities and the significant role that Lee had there, and as well with sort of all social life at W&L. As I understand it, there were at least two fraternities at Washington College before Robert E. Lee came there, but it seems like it would be really hard to argue that Lee's influence didn't create more and more fraternities, right? I think Ep.3 started when Lee was president, and I'll let you go into more of the specifics on that. The one that strikes me most is the Kappa Alpha Order, which formed in December of 1865 in the South Dormitory. I think they joke that it was in the southmost room of the South Dormitory, a very Southern fraternity. And of course, the headquarters, national headquarters for Kappa Alpha is at Mulberry Hill, which is in the same location that William Graham's home was when he ran Liberty Hall Academy. There's a bunch of fraternities that start during Lee's time, and I don't know that Robert E. Lee is in the room when these students get together and say, hey, let's form a fraternity. But Robert E. Lee is allowing them to happen, right? And if he didn't want fraternities to be there, he could certainly wave his hands and they would disappear. So could you talk more about this sort of fraternity culture and how it developed during the Lee years?
One of the things about fraternities that has changed is that almost all fraternities, when they were established in this country, were Christian in nature, and many of them have moved away from that. So, this may well have been something that caused Lee to say, okay, these institutions are okay. You mentioned there were just two here before the war, and they were founded in 1855 and 1856. Actually, there were a total of five fraternities that were established under Robert E. Lee and another six or seven that were established under Custis Lee. So essentially, with Robert E. Lee and Custis Lee, the modern fraternity system at Washington Lee was established. You mentioned KA, Sigma Chi. My fraternity was established here in 1866, SAE 1867, Phi Gamma Delta 1868, and ATO also in 1866. It had been established at VMI previously. I doubt seriously that if the Presbyterian leadership of the college had continued, you would have this burgeoning of fraternities because there was little control over them. Again, the same principle, we expect everyone to behave as a gentleman, applied to the establishment of the fraternities. And Lee placed a great deal of trust in the students, which was a very modern thing to do. And they responded by acting responsibly with their fraternities, with the honor system, with whatever student government they had. They didn't have a formal student self-government at this time, but they had some inkling of that. The YMCA was also established here under Lee, and Lee promoted that actively, and that was a very important part of the life of the university well into the 20th century. He was very consistent in promoting student activities. And we can talk also about athletics, which he promoted or allowed. He saw the students as being responsible for their own activities.
Yeah, could you expand more on what you mean by the YMCA? Because I think most listeners are probably thinking swimming pools and, some activities during the summer. But I know the YMCA back then was as much like fraternities, it was very explicitly a Christian organization. And I think they actually met in Lee Chapel, then just called the College Chapel or the Chapel, but where Lee's office was behind that and the museum that's been closed for 5 years. There was the library, and that's where the YMCA would meet for activities. So, what does this group look like? What are they doing?
Well, as you mentioned, it's much more of an intellectual activity, a social activity. It's not focused primarily on athletics at this time. That was through intercollegiate sports developed under Lee as well. The students discussed things. They were active in service programs just as they are today. They tried to bring people into the organization. It was the largest organization on the campus at that time, and it continued to be very active in all aspects of Christian life, as you mentioned, right up to World War II even.
I think the key thing that Lee wants students to do when he is at Washington College, and Lee writes much more extensively on this subject, is wanting students to attain education to be leaders in this new destroyed country, right? I mean, they're rebuilding the South. He needs people who are strong leaders, have values that will make them successful and help their children be successful and so on. He has a very long-term vision, and a good example of this is when he implements modern languages. He's not totally opposed to Latin and Greek. In fact, his father, who wrote many letters to the Lees when he was in Barbados, was frequently giving them advice from Epicurean philosophy and a bunch of other classical values. But Lee had recognized that Latin and Greek probably aren't going to rebuild the Southern economy. I was a classics major, so I can attest it's not the best way to build an empire, but he wanted students to learn more practical languages. He implemented Spanish, which he thought was really important after serving in the Mexican War. I can imagine these student groups, the fraternities, YMCA, even student newspapers, student publications, the Southern Collegian, I believe that also starts during Lee's presidency. These are things that give students the independence, the leadership that they need. They're what you might call resume builders in a modern sense, but they're actually giving students a little more life experience. And if you look at the students that come to Washington College, very little of them are actually staying for 4 years and getting a diploma. A lot of the students will come for 1 or 2 years and then go off back home because they don't need the diploma. They need the experience. They need the printmaking expertise to be a newspaper journalist. And so a lot of these social organizations that he creates or allows to be created, like fraternities, like the YMCA, like the Southern Collegian, those are clearly in student hands, much like how the honor system is. And so you can trace that sort of student responsibility that's so well regarded at W&L to this period for Lee. And I think that's just a really critical point to emphasize.
Well, selecting one's major, selecting a major from among a great variety of offerings. Not only developed modern languages, he began the concept of a business curriculum, a journalism curriculum, an engineering curriculum, law. At the time of his death, the law school became incorporated into Washington College, and it became Washington and Lee University. I have a quote similar to one you gave earlier from, I think, the Chattanooga Times in the 1830s. Quote,
1930s.
1930s, that's correct. Washington College under Lee's leadership was progressive, embodying a vision of a new South, a South that was different from the one that existed before the Civil War, which was based on slave labor and just a few crops, practically no industrialization, no transportation. So his vision was broader than Washington College and included a real makeover of the South. The term New South was not coined until the 1870s by Henry Grady, but I have argued in my article on Robert E. Lee and the New South that he was not only a progenitor of this idea, perhaps the first advocate and practitioner of the New South ideals.
Yeah, and I don't want to go off on too much of a tangent, but there were a lot of younger Southerners, especially young plantation owners prior to the Civil War, who were sort of early in this New South movement, thinking, hey, I see this institution that we're in is sort of doomed and we need to reinvigorate. And I can imagine Lee in being a very moderate in his political views, and especially when it comes to secession, he's not a fire eater jumping off. I think he shared some of the concerns about the long-term stability of the antebellum South and the new start that he gets in 1865 at Washington College, one of many offers that he's made, and not the most illustrious offer that he's made. I think that really gave him a chance to implement these goals that he had. And let's not forget, too, that he had been superintendent at West Point for 3 years. He didn't like that job at all. He tried to get out of it, but he had experience from it, and I'm sure he had a lot of thoughts on how he could improve that system. And so allowing students to really take the lead in implementing this New South curriculum, the liberal arts concept, is just a major contribution that he made both to our college and, as you say, to the nation.
He favored the education of all classes and races of people. He realized that the system in place in the South before the Civil War was detrimental to black people and detrimental to white people as well. After the war, he said he rejoiced that slavery had been abolished, and he made the following quotation, I think before Congress. Let me read this. Where I am, the people have exhibited a willingness that the blacks should be educated, and they expressed an opinion that that would be better for the blacks and better for the whites. Now, he was not progressive enough to say we should have integrated schools, but he did favor the education of blacks, and his thoughts on this line were taken up by none other than Booker T. Washington, who was the best known educator and probably the best known African American figure in the nation in the second half of the 19th century. So, yes, his influence on education was broad. I'll give you the example of William Preston Johnson, who was a professor under him, son of Albert Sidney Johnson, the great Civil War military commander, founded Tulane University, modeled it to some considerable extent on Washington College, approached many of the same donors that Lee had been in touch with for Washington College, established Sophie Newcomb College on the same campus or right adjacent to Tulane. Not coeducation in the sense that men and women were in the same classes, but coeducation in the sense that this institution had both men and women in it. So Lee was broad in his approach to education. He really does not get enough credit for that. And I could point to other things that he promoted outside of education in the New South. He was the president of the Valley Railroad until he died to promote the development of railroads in the Shenandoah Valley and across the country. He was in continuous contact with philanthropists like George Peabody, who founded the Peabody Education Fund to educate the lower class people, primarily in the South. So he believed in a broad and efficacious approach to education generally.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that Lee's life, which was only a 5-year period here in Lexington, that he really paved the way for the future progress and that he inspired future educators at Washington and Lee University. I have a brief quote here I want to read from a speech that Francis Pendleton Gaines gave in the 1930s in the midst of the Great Depression, which was a very troubling time for the university. They had to make a lot of cuts. Dr. Gaines, who looked up to Lee personally as his role model, he has a lot of similarities with Lee in that he had also never set foot on campus before being offered the job. He really wanted to expand the college. He implemented a lot of the ideas that Lee had had for academic curricular growth. Even during the 1930s, he started implementing some of these. Gaines says in this speech, which we just produced for the General's Redoubt's website, and you can request a copy on our website under our swag page. It's called Lee, the Final Achievement. He says that to understand Lee of the later years, of the period between 1865 and 1870, is to learn something of the real man, and to learn something of a definite, a substantial, and a permanent contribution which he made. Gaines goes on in a very poetic oratorial flourish, as he's well known for, to commend the actual things that happen under Robert E. Lee's leadership. And we could go on and on about what those accomplishments were, what the influence was. But one of the things that is just so critical is, unlike in the Civil War, which is such a brief period and then it's over, Gettysburg happens once. The impact is long lasting, but it's a 3-day battle and that's it. The curricular changes that Robert E. Lee implements from 1865 to 1870, the social progress that he advances, the finances that he brings in and continue to come in, those continue to help us today. And in the same way that George Washington's donation of stock in 1796, that was a one-time donation, and we get dividends from the stock, but the legacy of Washington, the sort of aspirational goals that he had for American education systems, that has continued to shape 200 years of American education, not just at our college, but beyond. And so Lee's done that much the same. And I think my question for you, Neely, is just, I know you and I agree on this, but why do we need to tell students about Lee's impact on W&L? I think so many students come in today and Lee is just such an afterthought. I mean, even in the recent commencement speech, Lee wasn't even referenced at all. And so, such as you believe a critical figure, the most important figure in our university's history, why do we need to make sure people hear about him and learn about these contributions?
Well, I'm glad you put it in a positive way. My take is perhaps not quite as benign as yours. I believe that beginning a few years ago, there was an active effort across our country to demonize people like Lee, and that our university, if nothing else, sort of gave in to this trend. And I believe they often purposely don't mention Lee because they know he's controversial and they don't want to get into that sort of thing. And so I'm concerned about the way that Lee is being treated. I've written numerous things about it, Lee in the New South, Lee effect on the honor system, etc. And I believe that your quote about Washington applies also to Lee, as you do. And that it's interesting, they both wrote small treatises about gentlemanly conduct and that sort of thing. Their value systems are similar. Lee is related to George Washington by marriage, and he saw Washington as our greatest national hero. And what has been happening in recent years is that the fact that Lee fought for the Confederacy and the Confederacy supported slavery has led people to denigrate Robert E. Lee. And they don't look at other aspects of his life, and they don't look at the 5.5 years from Appomattox until his death. They focus on the 4 years that he fought for the Confederacy. It's interesting that the time period from Appomattox until his death was greater than the 4 years of the Confederacy. And they refuse, in many cases, to recognize that Lee was a great American. As Charles Francis Adams said when he came to visit the college in the early 20th century.
That's another pamphlet that we have reproduced and available for you to receive one for free from our website. So, I mean, there's no question how significant Lee's role is and how many non-Confederates have admired him. I mean, certainly the former Confederates loved him, but so did Northern abolitionists and, descendants of John Adams. There's no bigger Yankee than someone like that. And so, I think we really need to remember Lee's values and that they are aligned with Washington, who I think more people will be supportive of. And I just think for students that come to Washington and Lee, if you don't know Lee's role on the campus, his role and the education that you have, the continued effect that he has, you really need to go and read General Lee's College by Ollinger Crenshaw. That'll express it well. Or read Flood the Last Years, or just read any biography of Lee that goes into his contributions, because I think that really will change your perspective on it. And this brief episode really doesn't even get to the bulk of what Lee has done. I know, Neely, you want to talk about Lee's role with sports and how sports actually develop at W&L, but I think we'll save that for the next episode where I'll be speaking about the history of sports at W&L, and we'll be sure to cover a lot of that there. But that's just yet another critical component of the W&L experience that starts under Robert E. Lee. So, Neely, I want to thank you so much for coming here today, and I hope your continued research in Washington and Lee's history convinces a lot of people that we need to maybe change some of our recent course in the last few years and restore Robert E. Lee's place of importance at this university. So thanks again, Neely, and have a great week.
Thank you, Cameron.